So I want to talk a little bit today, and I'm very excited to do so, about my research. And I hope to convince you by the end of this hour of why it is important and how to integrate full life cycle analyses of different species interacting in a natural system with each other, and how they respond to global change, which in turn then changes biodiversity. So the need to make sort of short-term predictions or forecasts of biodiversity change has recently really skyrocketed, and making the whole discipline of ecological forecasting quite important in ecology in general, simply because out of the fact that we are in the midst of a huge biodiversity crisis. So currently there are approximately 10,000 plant and animal species at an acute risk of local extinctions. And as ecologists, we have become relatively good at describing past and current patterns of this biodiversity loss. But so the 1 million question is, are we able to actually make robust short-term predictions of how biodiversity will change under novel conditions of these complex effects of human pressures and equally complex natural systems? And before we sort of answer the question of can we make robust predictions, an important point to make, or an important question to ask, is why do we need to make predictions? So why do we need to predict biodiversity change under novel conditions in the future, instead of just looking at the patterns we observed in the past and sort of try to interpret what may happen in the future from this? And the short answer to this is that in many disciplines over the years, it has been more and more evident that anticipating and mitigating emerging challenges is far better and more cost-effective than reacting to these challenges once problems begin to occur, right? And this has been seen in fields such as invasion ecology, fisheries management, economy, and so forth. And so, for instance, when we had this very simplified example systems of a predator and prey using different types of habitats defined by vegetation structure across space and time, we may predict that under novel regimes of human pressures and climate change, the predator may experience higher mobility or may need higher mobility in order to persist in the landscape. And so then we can react faster by providing better functional connectivity, something which is actually already being implemented in many European countries. Or we can also predict a loss of habitat, which actually may lead to a need for higher mobility, and thereby then implement restoration measures in natural habitats to sort of make the habitat more suitable locally, and thereby perhaps also increase the abundance of the prey species. We can even go further and predict that the prey species may actually adapt to climate change or to disease dynamics, so maybe less influenced by certain disease outbreaks, which may then strengthen the quality of local habitats for everyone, and thereby make our restoration efforts actually cost-effective, right? And so the point is that anticipating through prediction and mitigating issues before they really create huge problems is very advantageous for conservation planning, for management. And if you want to know more about this topic, I suggest that you watch one of our previous seminars by Vicky Bolt, who's actually talked in a lot of detail of how we can use forecasts for conservation, really. And so if we accept that forecasts are important in biodiversity research, the question is then, how do we do these types of near-term predictions? So the most fundamental way we can do so is, if you look, say, at this previous example that I showed you, we can look at abundances of the predator, of the prey, of maybe even vegetation and so forth. And we can use the intrinsic properties and qualities of the time series of abundances, say, but it can also be population growth rate, of diversity indices, and so forth. And we can use this intrinsic properties to then predict into the future. There are quite a few methods available, that some of them have been developed as part of the ecological forecasting of our community. for instance, by Nicholas Clark. You can, he's offering courses. It's quite exciting to do this sort of time series analysis for biological data sets. And here also there was a fantastic seminar by Frank Pennekamp a few weeks ago, who has talked in more depth about the opportunities and challenges of doing sort of these time series analysis, right? So you can go and watch this. But essentially, one key challenge we have as empirical ecologists that we work on our, often data-limited empirical system is that whenever we try to use these sort of predictions based just on the intrinsic properties of a time series, we end up with predictions that may be quite difficult to interpret and have huge uncertainties associated with it. So this is the same time series that I just showed you before, except that now the y-axis has sort of increased because of the uncertainty and prediction. And it is my attempt to use a state space model to predict the future abundance of a particular population, the flamenco population in Doñana National Park. So we have here population counts, annual counts, that have been conducted since the late 1970s in this waterbird species, but also for many waterbird species in Doñana National Park. It's a fantastic data set. But again, when we want to do predictions into the future, it becomes quite challenging if we use just simple state space modeling approaches, because of the uncertainties, and also because the average predictions are quite questionable, as we would expect the abundances to either stay stable or decrease into the future due to the increasing drought in southern Spain, something that I will talk about a bit more later. And the problem with these empirical systems that we often have is where we have data limitations, where we even, for many of the systems we study, we don't even have long time series to do this sort of time series analysis. This creates an essential problem where many ecologists say we cannot do any kind of predictions because we don't have the data, right? And then in turn, many of the theoretical ecologists or people that develop theory and forecasting then basically get stuck with working always with the same data sets of a limited number of species that have been followed over long time series, often in natural systems, right? That don't experience the type of pressures many species of conservation concern, of management concern are experiencing. So to circumvent some of the issues with doing time series analyses and forecasts, there is methods that actually use biological mechanisms, first principles, that are assumed to be universally applicable and then can be linked to fitness components of organisms, so survival, reproduction, growth, dispersal, and so forth, and which can then be used to predict their behavior or changes in these fitness components into the future, as these biotic mechanisms are assumed to be universal, right? So a good example of this may be thermal mortality curves for many invertebrate species, where we have thermal maxima and minima under which species can develop and survive, beyond which then certain death is likely, was inevitable. There's a huge literature also on energy budgets. So first principles of how organisms can allocate resources to somatic maintenance versus reproduction, and how this can be then integrated to assess the changes in these fitness components. There's also most fundamentally, we can use threshold of, for instance, densities such as carrying capacity, or interspecific densities such as food abundance, to create thresholds for survival, reproduction, and changes in behavior of certain species, right? And essentially all of these biotic mechanisms allow us to understand how fitness components, and by fitness I mean the ability of organisms to reproduce, to transmit their genetic materials into future generations. And these biotic mechanisms allow us to link these components to changes in environmental pressures, such as, for instance, climate changes, right? As you can see here on this hypothetical deer example. And a few years ago, we did a review where we looked at how these sort of links between climate and fitness components are made in the literature, focusing on mammals. And the first thing we realized really is that most studies really just look at one vital rate or one fitness component. So they just look at survival or reproduction. Often that depends on which species they are investigating. And they use this to infer on potential changes of abundances under environmental changes, right? So for instance, saying that if reproduction decreases under climate change, the population is at the risk of extinction. But the other thing that our review also showed is that in reality, the responses of different fitness components, so survival versus reproduction versus dispersal, are quite complex in natural systems. So here you see just an example of 10 species. On the bottom, you see, actually, that's not 10 species, 4, that's more, that's 11 species, I think. But the point is that you see at the bottom the different fitness components, so survival, reproduction, and growth. And you see here at the left how they may respond in the future under climate change, which can be negative responses, so decreases, no response at all, increases in this vital rate, or responses that depend on different contexts, so on interactions with other drivers or other vital rates. And you can see for most of these species, whether we look at reproduction or survival or growth, may provide quite different interpretation of what may happen to population dynamics, because these different fitness components respond quite differently to environmental change and may be even able to compensate each other under environmental pressures. Meaning that, for instance, in this hypothetical example of the deer, even under hot and dry conditions that may decrease substantially survival, this may not lead necessarily to an extinction, right? Or to decreases in local abundance, which can then be suggestive of decreases in biodiversity or ecosystem services that these species may provide. Instead, we must realize that population fitness, right, necessarily integrates and combines not only survival, but also reproduction. So we need to look at these two components together and how they respond to environmental fluctuations, right? Because these together give an estimate of the persistence of a population in a habitat. But beyond that, population fitness, so the combination of survival and reproduction, actually links quite nicely to community dynamic and biodiversity change, because it is the fitness that determines the niche of a given population in a community and how it interacts with other species in this community. And so for the rest of the talk, I want to give you some examples of recent studies that I've participated in, where it's highlighted why we need to consider the entire life cycle and the responses of several fitness components to global change, in this case, climate change, to understand or to be able to predict changes in abundances. And then also in the second part of how we can use this concept or the theory of population fitness and life cycle analysis to create more robust forecasts, even for data-limited systems, and then expand our understanding of what may happen to biodiversity. So I want to start by talking about this fantastic study system, the Maasai giraffe, which I was really fortunate to work on with the Wild Nature Institute. They've been studied, so it's led by Monica Bond and Derek Lee, and they've been studying very diligently for over 10 years now a giraffe metapopulation here in Tanzania. And the giraffe the population is basically distributed. You can see locations of individuals in purple. They are distributed in protected areas, which you can see here in green. But they also move among these protected areas, and they do so by going and moving and living in human-dominated landscapes. So landscapes are dominated by small villages and also bigger towns where human pressures are quite intense. And one thing that Monica and Lee have been looking at is how giraffes are affected by climate change, by changes in rainfall. And they've sort of modeled adult survival of giraffes, which you see here as response on the y-axis, as a function of rainfall, standardized values here on the x-axis, And they did so for giraffes, individual giraffes that were primarily located close to protected areas on the left column, or far away from protected areas, so more towards human settlements. And they also split the prediction of adult survival by whether they measured them in the dry and the long range or the short range seasons. So there's 3 primary seasons in the ecosystem. And one thing, interestingly, that I found is that adult survival actually decreases slightly with increased rainfall for all these contexts, right? But particularly so in the short range seasons for giraffes that are close to protected areas. And you can see this is actually a quite steep decrease in survival. And the blue is, I think, for females, and the red is for males. So these are for different individuals of the giraffes. And so they attributed the steep decline to an increased risk of diseases and predation by lions, in this case, under these conditions. And the point here is that these types of analyses have been used for a very long time. You can find in the literature of people then suggesting, or researchers suggesting that, well, adult survival is decreasing under increased rainfall. Rainfall is projected to increase into the future. And therefore, the giraffe must be threatened by climate change into the near term to midterm future. However, giraffes don't just consist of adults to begin with, and they are not affected just by rainfall. So there are many things that affect giraffes, which are direct disease dynamics, food quality in different habitats, predation pressures, as well as poaching, direct poaching by humans in different habitats. And what we did in the study is that we combined all these different pressures and modeled the life cycle dynamics, so survival of adults, but also reproduction and also dispersal, as a function of all of these different pressures, so human settlements, law enforcement, predation, and climate change. We did an individual-based model, and we forecasted metapopulation abundance changes. And this is basically the key result that we found here. This is represented here. And you see the metapopulation abundance as on the y-axis here represented, with sort of the distribution here of the abundances is among different simulations of the IBM. And you can see how it changes among different scenarios of the effects, human pressures and climate change, of course, on the giraffes. And one thing you can see, we don't need to go into detail on the scenarios, but if you look here at scenarios that change climate change, so increases in rainfall, if they are strong enough, so under the strongest scenarios by the IPCC, the metapopulations is indeed projected to decrease a little bit, yes, compared to the control scenario where nothing changes. But this is nothing compared to the effects of other direct measures on the giraffe survival and dispersal, which has to do with managing law enforcement, so preventing basically poaching. This is what really drives, what really produces the significant changes that we see currently in the system in the giraffes. The conclusion of this example being that giraffes are really unfazed by fluctuations in background climate conditions now in the near term, if you consider all other things that affect their demography. They're much more affected by direct human threats, and incorporating direct human threats and the spatio-temporal changes of the abundances in giraffes produces the best forecasts and also forecasts that are most relevant for the near-term management of this population. And then we can go to another example, again, of showing why life cycle analysis is so important in forecasts. And in this case, we're going from this huge charismatic mammal to another very charismatic mammal, but this time very small, the mouse lemur. I've been lucky to collaborate on this data set with the University of Zurich and the German Primate Center. And they have been studying the mouse lemur in Western Madagascar since 1995, more or less. And while they have been studying the population, the system there has experienced quite dramatic climate change that is currently ongoing. So over the study period, temperatures have been increasing and rainfall has been decreasing. What we have done then is we used this climatic information, and we used the information about survival and reproduction of different life cycle stages of the mouse lemurs to link these two factors and to then model and project population dynamics under changes in climate change, in climate, in both rainfall and temperature. And one thing that we found is that the changes in climate over the study period have actually led to lower survival. So you see here annual survival rates on the y-axis across the years. And in our models, due to changes in the climate, both survival of juveniles in gray and adults here and the yellowish orange, both for females and males, have decreased. Again, leading to sort of expectations that the populations, because of that, is under extreme risk of local extinction. However, another thing that has also happened simultaneously is that climate change has actually led to higher recruitment, right? So the species of the population then has compensated by recruiting more individuals into the local habitats, patches. This is by direct reproduction, and some of this recruitment has also been through new juveniles immigrating into local patches when the densities are low. And what this then essentially means is that if we do then, we used this information of this compensatory effects of reproduction on decreases in survival, and we project the population into the future. And you can then, we did these projections by first assuming that the past climate will remain as is into the future. So there will be no further climate change. And you see that the population remains relatively stable. Yes. And we even did climate change projections where we assumed that the climate will remain as in the second half of the study period, where we had quite substantial effects of climate change. And here, although the population is at a bit of a slightly more risk of extinction, nevertheless, in most of the simulations, the population is more variable, but it remains stable, right? So basically, showing effectively that mouse lemurs appear to be adapting to climate change. And this may lead to increased population fluctuations, but may nevertheless allow the population to persist in the short term, at least in the habitats. And these dynamics are only discernible and only predictable through integrated analysis across the entire life cycle, right? Specifically, especially in the absence of these extremely long abundance data sets that may allow us to nitpick or discern these patterns maybe from just intrinsic properties of a time series. And in the third example, then, I want to show how this information of how this integrated life cycle analysis can then be actually scaled, not from just one population, but for several populations in the community. And here I want to show some work we've been doing in Doñana National Park, which I've just shown you in the introduction, the example of the flamencos. And Doñana is certainly known for its extensive wetlands. But under climate change, many of the lagoons are drying up, and the habitat is increasingly is being invaded by shrubs. But even the shrublands are not doing very well, and there's been quite substantial changes in the dynamic and the species composition of different shrub species, with some species being winners and some losers. And we wanted to understand why this may be so, or which shrub species will perform better under drought conditions. And what we did here is that we had abundance data of different life cycle stages for 5 shrub species. And we then did a latent state model where from the abundance data, we sort of inferred demographic rates across the life cycle of all of these 5 species. And we modeled the key demographic rates, which would be survival of juveniles and adults as a function of interspecific densities, and also the main climatic driver, which is rainfall in this case. And we therefore had sort of feedbacks between density of the focal species and its neighbors under changes in climate, which we call all integrate into forecasts. And what we did so one thing that we saw is that when we integrate dynamically the climate change of all the components of the system together in the community, we get better forecasting skills in our estimates of abundance changes into the near future. But what we also see is that we clearly see, and this is something that we also observe in the system, that there are some species, particularly rosemary, that appear to be doing quite well. But whether it does really, really, really well or okayish, but not, not exploding in its abundances, depends on whether we consider the effects of rainfall, not just on the focal species, but also on the neighboring shrubs. Because if you consider the effects of rainfall on the neighboring shrubs, we get more robust forecasts. And this is because in the projections where neighboring shrubs are affected by climate change simultaneously, as well as the focal species, in this case rosemary, some shrubs under novel climate regimes, under novel rainfall regimes, actually are expected to increase slightly in abundances compared to the past and current abundances of these species. Rosemary, in turn, is not very much affected by rainfall, hence it's more resilient, hence its predicted increases in abundance and also observed abundances. But what happens is that if under climate change, some other neighbors are also resilient, this may then decrease the ability of rosemary to spread into novel habitats and increase its abundance, because rosemary is foremost affected by the density of conspecific and interspecific neighbors, right? And so these projections on different life cycle stages of the entire community create much more reliable predictions of what is happening in the system, and are quite promising to also lead management in the national park in this case. And the fact that it's looking at demographic traits as sort of key determinants of forecasts, or key drivers of forecast accuracy, has also been shown in another publication that we did on the system. And so these three examples that I show are hopefully convince you a little bit that it's important to consider the full life cycle of species to predict abundance changes in the system, and not just looking at isolation, at reproduction, at survival, or just physiological responses, and then infer of what may happen to populations in the future. But the second part of the talk is then sort of to wrap up is how can we use the concept of these full life cycle analysis that give us an idea of population fitness to create more robust forecasts. And in this case, I want to talk about another study that we're recently developing, which is on the lynx and the rabbits. And this is sort of a good example, because for many systems that we're working on in conservation, we typically do not have long data or long-term data of individual survival and reproduction measured over across time and space. And we sort of need to get parameters from other publications and sort of putting them together, like literally like puzzle pieces to estimate the potential parameter space from which we can model our system of interest. Yes, and we can essentially here use life history theory, right? So the understanding of how population maximize fitness under environmental change by allocating to reproduction versus survival, to sort of create a more realistic set of parameters to model our systems in question. In this case, if you look at the rabbits and the lynx, we know, so this is a really nice system to study under global change, under climate change, because we know that declines in rabbit populations are associated with decreases in lynx. In this case, they're very lynx fecundities. And we know also that climate change will exacerbate the issue, because climate change is severely affecting rabbits by essentially destroying their habitat in southern Spain. And we wanted to find out what this may mean for the system for the interactions of the rabbits and the lynx, and for the survival or the persistence of populations of lynx across their distribution range. And what we did then, we sort of fitted a IBM of lynx and rabbits jointly across the distribution ranges, where we had various components such as survival, age structure, dispersal, climate affecting these different vital rates. But one thing we did not have was detailed individual-based data for which we can parameterize these models. So we didn't have long-term data on rabbits nor on the lynx, and certainly not on both of these systems together. We had to sort of collect data from the literature and put it together. And while doing so, there were certain scenarios that we needed to test of adult survival, of different carrying capacity of the habitats for the lynx, of dispersal, juvenile survival. So different combinations of parameters that we needed to use to validate the model, to calibrate it, so that our model would resemble the best the observed abundances that we know currently for the lynx and the rabbits. These are a lot of combinations. But we can use information on life history, right, to decrease our combinations of parameters. Because we know that for the lynx, for instance, adult survival must always be higher than juvenile survival. There must be, the local survival must be higher than, for instance, survival of the dispersers and so forth, right? So we can use the previous study and the theory we developed from other predictions of full life cycle analyses to then sort of decrease our potential combinations of different parameters to fit these types of complex models across different systems to project joint dynamics under climate change. And I think this also then brings sort of the point that when we have fewer dimensions in data and we just look at abundances without looking more mechanistically at various components that make abundance, this may lead to a propensity to choose one best fit model and just go with it, right? Which perhaps may lead to worst management recommendations if you don't know the mechanisms behind what generate these abundances. And this is sort of a forecast trap that has been suggested recently in the literature. And I think if we integrate life history theory into our forecasts, we may have a stronger basis to do sort of theory-driven and alternative scenarios that may scale from individuals to entire communities through interactions. And for instance, in the case of the lynx, we may create alternative models where we assume better connectivity for the lynx versus better habitat for the rabbits, right? And by then jointly forecasting the system, we may then sort of assess the target numbers of what we want to see in the responses of, for instance, the immigrants of the lynx, how many we want to see, how many we can manage, how we can compare this to observed dynamics, something that provides a wider range of management scenarios for local for local management of this critical system and of many other systems. And so to sort of wrap up this talk, I think that this aggregation, so even if we have the opportunity to look at just changes in abundances or changes in diversity, this aggregation is sometimes mandatory because we perhaps cannot make inferences from just abundances, but also it may be necessary sometimes because the complexity of global change often requires us to understand the complexity of a system a bit better in order to be able to predict and to validate our predictions. And assessing life histories can then make the changes in the relative changes in survival and reproductions under global change drivers can make a really big difference in how we interpret population and community dynamics under environmental change, right? and what our predictions say about these dynamics. And extrapolating abundance changes by looking just at survival or reproduction isolation, which is still quite common in the literature, can create substantial bias. In turn, integrating life history into forecasts can provide a quite efficient way to develop realistic dynamic projectional predictions under data limitations, because it allows us to decrease our potential parameter space. And so I want to wrap by just saying that if you see a little critter telling you that, I am growing faster, we must necessarily always ask, does this really mean that there is more of you? Or do we need to look at the broader life cycle, at a potential understanding that a faster growth may also mean a lower survival, right? Due to intrinsic trade-offs, compensatory effects, and so forth. And with this, I would like to thank you all. And I am ready to take questions. And I also want to thank all my collaborators, of course, and the volunteers who have helped collect the data and manage the data and so forth. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Maria. That was wonderful. So let's open it up to questions. You can either put questions in the chat or feel free to just unmute yourself. We're a small group. Go ahead and ask directly. So while we're waiting for questions, I can get started. Watching your talk made me think of, lots of different organisms that we have around here, think about animals and plants for management. And I appreciate the need to include different life histories, but I also know getting that data is a lot of work. And like you showed in the second part, being able to comb the literature to find information is really useful. Yep. But I guess as you start thinking about either the giraffes or the mouse lemurs or rabbits and lynx, as you start thinking about any of those projects, I guess where do you start? Do you start with the management and what is needed for management, or do you start with there's a system and that you've have some data on life history parameters and then look to see what else is needed and then go to literature? I guess, how do you get started?
So I think it's kind of a tough question but I think it doesn't have to be either or, right? It doesn't have to be. It depends. So I think we need to do both. So for instance, in the lynx and the rabbit example that I showed, and some other system that my team is currently working on, we basically start by saying, okay, there is a management need, there's a management question. And we know from theory that, for instance, there are, for instance, one key thing that I didn't maybe go into detail, but the point that under, say, climate change, often the density effects are critical in buffering many species. So things work quite differently when there's low or high densities of different populations. So we know that. And so, for instance, we can just say, okay, we know this is true, and we know the species is affected by climate change, but this will not be the same under high density versus on a low density, and this may also affect their movement between habitats. And if there's a management need to, for instance, create corridors, we can pull information that we have from the literature, because I think there are a few species that have not been studied at all. And many species, we actually have quite a lot of information, but piecemeal from different locations, from different times. And we can use this piecemeal information to sort of integrate into a coherent picture. And we can use life history theory from the good systems that we have, right, to help us with this integration. Yeah, and so I think on the other hand, we have these wonderful long-term data series that can be used to then develop the sort of theory that help us to manage the bad systems in terms of data quality. I don't know if this helps your
Yeah.
If this answers your question.
Yeah, I think it's just really encouraging to see that while it would be nice to have long-term data, that's not always going to happen. And while it'd be nice to know all the complexities about a system in one location where we're managing, that's also not necessary. We can use all these combined information to make predictions. So that's really encouraging. Other questions?
I have a quick question if you can hear me.
Yes, go ahead, Tom.
Sorry, I've been having some technical difficulties. So that was really interesting. Thank you. How scalable is this in complexity? You know, those the studies, the work you described is largely a few species across relatively smaller scales. Could this be expanded to models that you're, you know, with the general principles of hundreds of species, thousands of species within there? At which point does the complexity make these additional parameters stop falling to pieces, I guess?
Well, I mean, yeah, that's a very good question. I don't know. I don't think anyone has ever tried to answer that, to be honest. I mean, I think it is obvious that if you're talking about thousands and hundreds of species, if we have computational power to model them, if we had the necessary information, all of these species, we could probably model them, I would say, right? From these first principles and so forth. The issue is that often we do not know all the information on thousands of species, and then guessing or deriving it from different parameters becomes, of course, such a multidimensional issue that it's not possible. But I also think that often this question of increases in complexity is often used as an excuse to not try at all. Like I've seen this, I've seen this often, that where I say, well, we need to, like when you look, say at, in this case, for instance, the lynx and the rabbits, to say that we need to look at the competitor of the lynx, right, to incorporate this into this modeling system, so there would be another level, because this is critically important to understand what may happen, how the lynx may disperse or not in the different habitat quality territories. We can do that, but it requires quite a lot of thinking and quite a lot of figuring with the models, and it should not be used as an excuse that it becomes too complex, because we can solve many of these complexities by using theoretically driven forecasts, I would say. I don't know if this answers your question.
Yeah.
I mean,
that definitely answers my question. I think the thing that always comes to my mind is the harder you lean on the theory, there is a risk that it starts to become very difficult to validate this when you start with actual data. And it might be, I guess it's just because of all of those risks of like failing to capture those additional effects, maybe. But no, I thought that was really interesting and good answer.
No, it's absolutely correct. I mean, you can, in the end, you need to be able to validate, but it's just, I think we need to try, right? We need to just at least try to, so because I see it a lot, where, you would see papers, changes in physiology of this and this impacts on ecosystem services, but there is often a link missing to the population dynamics and confounding factors, and then there is always this, well, we don't have enough data. But I think we need to try harder to find data, to integrate data, to create perhaps more theory and more modeling to be able to do so. Yes, but of course some limitations will remain, of course. Yeah.
Awesome, thank you.
Great. Other questions for Maria?
Yes, I have a question about about the model of the giraffes, that the output was like a meta-population abundance predictions in different scenarios. I just have like a short question about how did you make this output? I think it's really nice and really interesting, like to see how it's changing the different meta-population abundance in the different scenarios.
What do you mean? How did I make it?
Yes, and with, so did you take the model and then did you just, so how did you make it?
So we did, we made a individual, let me share the screen again so I can go to the specific plot. This one. So what we did essentially is never mind. We created an individual-based model. From the individual-based model, so we had individuals living in different subpopulations of the giraffes, which then could move between the groups in the model. And at the end of each iteration, we had the abundance of the different groups of the entire metapopulation, right? And we then validated the model with independent data of abundances that were obtained for different years and also in a different study in a adjacent study area. So we validated that the model is correct. And then we sort of perturbed parameters, specific parameters in the model. So for instance, here, this would be the effect of human settlements, or basically, I think linear infrastructures, particularly on dispersal. We know this affects from previous studies, and we know how, we know the parameter of how the linear infrastructures affect dispersal, and so we would then assume an increase, say, of linear infrastructures based on projections of land use change in the system. Yeah. And we would then sort of run the IBM again and see the changes in the metapopulation abundance based on the scenario. And we would do this for all other scenarios. So this would be law enforcement, decrease, increase, increases in predation, higher rainfall, and then a combination of different scenarios. Yes, does this answer your question?
Yes, thank you very much.
Okay.
Other questions?
I have a question.
Yes.
Hey,
Hi,
hi.
Maria. Thank you for your talk.
Hi.
Very interesting. I was wondering, like, if you have used for all the different studies you showed, like the same, not the same, but like the IBM as a structure, as a kind of a model you used, or did you use different type of models who can integrate the full life cycle, which you could perhaps recommend to use?
I've done all kinds of models. Yes. I mean, I have done, so I think recently I've been moving more and more towards IBMs, because IBMs are just wonderful in integrating different stuff. They're just so flexible. The only issue with IBMs is that they don't give you, often they'll give you sort of nice asymptomatic metrics like population growth rate that we all like to work with. And they take longer to run, right? Because you need different scenarios, and because you need the iterations and you have the uncertainty and all of this. But I think the IBM is ideal. If you're working with detection issues, of course, there's the integrated population model, which is often done like in a Bayesian framework, right? Where you can integrate different sources of data, which simultaneously then allows you to account for detection issues. Actually, I'm working on one of them right now. And I've also used quite a bit of IPMs, so integral projection models. The lemur example was actually a matrix population model. It was no IBM, it was just a matrix. So yeah, I think this can be done in many various ways. The easiest, I think, and the most flexible are IBMs to me. So individual or agent-based models, let's say, what they're called.
Okay, thanks.
Other questions? Got a few more minutes.
Yeah, we have a lot of time. I went quick. Go ahead. You can ask me anything if you think it's silly or if you have some biological question on the systems, whatever you like.
What was the biggest difference when you were doing plants versus animals?
Good question. So plants don't have detection issues. So you don't, with animals, for instance, you often need to, like the survival you model is typically apparent survival often, or reproduction is, sometimes you don't know if the reproduction comes from immigration, unless you have genetic data available. So these types of challenges, I think, and animals are more difficult to get long-term data on because they're difficult to follow. They have all these, they move, so they have the spatial component. That's, I think, the most difficult things, like the space, immigration, and the detection. Plants are relatively easy in that because they don't really move anywhere and they just stay put, and that's great. In plants, the biggest challenge is, I think, the reproduction. That's a huge challenge because seed banks, most plants have seed banks, and it's incredibly difficult to understand how long seeds stay in the seed bank and what really happens to them, because there's no way of studying seed banks without perturbing them. And it's a conundrum because you cannot study them in natural conditions because you have to perturb the soil to study it. And so whenever we fit plant models, we always get population explosions because we get something wrong with the reproduction. That's a very common problem. Yeah.